Hello, kindergarten, and happy Thursday. It is time for another story. Today, we're going to be listening to the story of Ruby the Copycat. Again, this story is called Ruby the Copycat, and it's by Peggy Rathmann. So, looking at the cover, good readers always pay attention to the cover of a story. What do you notice? Take a moment to look at the cover. What do you notice on the cover of this story? Well, one thing that you might notice is that there's a blackboard and it looks like they're doing some math problems, so they're probably at school. And you probably have noticed that the two girls are wearing almost the same sweater. There's something a little bit different about her sweater. Her sweater looks like the flowers are pinned to the sweater rather than coming with it like hers. So, Ruby the Copycat. What do you think of the term copycat? Well, copycat is somebody that imitates or copies everything that you do. So it seems like maybe this character, Ruby, is copying someone in the story all the time. And let's see whether or not she continues that. So again, this week we're focusing in on character change and what a character is like at the beginning of the story and what they're like at the end of the story. Again, we're paying attention to what a character is like at the beginning and the end. So we want to see how they change. And we also want to pay attention to the problem of the story and what is the solution. So let's go ahead and get started with the wonderful story of Ruby the Copycat by Peggy Rathmann, who is the author and the illustrator. Monday was Ruby's first day in Miss Hart's class. Class, this is Ruby, announced Miss Hart. Ruby, you may use the empty desk behind Angela. Angela is the girl with the pretty red bow in her hair. Angela smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Angela's bow and tiptoed to her seat. I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend, said Miss Hart. Does anyone have something to share? I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding, said Angela. That's exciting, said Miss Hart. Ruby raised her hand halfway. I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding too. What a coincidence, said Miss Hart. Angela turned and smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at the top of Angela's head. Class, please take out your reading books, said Miss Hart. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped all the way home on one foot. When Ruby came back to school, she was wearing a red bow in her hair. She slid into her seat behind Angela. I like your bow, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. Class, please take out your math books, said Miss Hart. So let's stop and think for a second, because we want to think about character change and what a character is like at the beginning of the story. So again, we can see a couple of things about the character of Ruby. The story told us that this was her first day in school. And we notice something on these first couple of pages. When the little girl Angela says that she went to her sister's wedding and was a flower girl, Ruby said the same exact thing. And then we also notice that when Ruby went home and she came back to class in the afternoon, she was also wearing a red bow. So we notice that at the beginning of the story, Ruby is a copycat, and she is copying everything that Angela is doing. And I wonder throughout the story if she's going to keep doing that. So let's keep reading to find out. On Tuesday morning, Angela wore a sweater with daisies on it. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped home sideways. When Ruby came back to school after lunch, she was wearing a sweater with daisies on it. I like your sweater, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. So again, we're continuing to see that Ruby is copying Angela. On Wednesday, Angela wore a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. After lunch, Ruby hopped back to school wearing a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. "Why are you sitting like that?" whispered Angela. "Wet paint," said Ruby. On Thursday morning, during sharing time, Angela modeled the flower girl dress she wore at her sister's wedding. Ruby modeled her flower girl dress too, right after lunch. Angela didn't whisper anything. So again, we're continuing to see Ruby copying everything that Angela does. And the story just told us that when Ruby modeled her flower girl dress, Angela didn't whisper anything. So I wonder, how does Angela feel right now? How do you think Angela feels about Ruby copying her all the time? Well, I think that Angela, looking at her face and the fact that she didn't whisper anything, probably does not like it. And she's probably getting frustrated or even mad that Ruby keeps copying her. So let's keep reading to find out what happens next. By coincidence, on Friday morning, both girls wore red and lavender striped dresses. At lunchtime, Angela raced home. When Angela came back to school, she was wearing black. So again, how does Angela feel about Ruby copying her? Well, we see again that she's really, really mad and frustrated when she races home, she runs home, and then she comes back to class wearing a black outfit. So again, we can really tell in the story, Angela does not like Ruby copying her, and she's really, really frustrated and upset. On Friday afternoon, Miss Hart asked everyone to write a short poem. "Who would like to read first?" asked Miss Hart. Angela raised her hand. She stood by her desk and read, "I had a cat I could not see because it stayed in back of me. It was a very loyal pet. It's sad we never really met." "That was very good," said Miss Hart. "Now who's next?" Miss Hart looked around the room. "Ruby?" Ruby stood and recited slowly. "I had a nice pet who I never met, but it always stayed behind me. I'm sure it was a cat too." Ruby smiled at the back of Angela's head. Someone whispered. Ruby sat down. "What a coincidence," murmured Miss Hart. So it seems like, again, not only does Angela feel frustrated, but it seems like her teacher, Miss Hart, does not like the copying either. Angela scribbled something on a piece of paper. She passed it to Ruby. The note said, "You copied me. I'm telling Miss Hart. P.S. I hate your hair that way." Ruby buried her chin in the collar of her blouse. A big tear rolled down her nose and plopped onto the note. When the bell rang, Miss Hart sent everyone home except Ruby. Miss Hart closed the door of the schoolroom and sat on the edge of Ruby's desk. "Ruby, dear," she said gently, "you don't need to copy everything Angela does. You can be anything you want to be, but be Ruby first. I like Ruby." Miss Hart smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Miss Hart's beautiful polished fingernails. "Have a nice weekend," said Miss Hart. "Have a nice weekend," said Ruby. On Monday morning, Miss Hart said, "I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend." "I did. I went to the opera." Miss Hart looked around the room. "Does anyone have something to share?" Ruby waved her hand. Glued to every finger was a pink plastic fingernail. "I went to the opera too," said Ruby. "She did not," whispered Angela. Miss Hart folded her hands and looked very serious. Ruby dear, said Miss Hart gently, did you do anything else this weekend? So let's stop and think for a second. We know that Ruby throughout the story has been copying Angela. And we know that Angela got really mad and frustrated about it. And unfortunately, she hurt Ruby's feelings. But now we notice something else in the story, that Ruby's not copying Angela anymore. She's now copying the teacher. So why do you think she decided to copy the teacher? Why did she stop copying Angela? And why is she copying the teacher? Why do you think she did that? Take a moment to think about that. Why would Ruby want to start copying Miss Hart? Ruby peeled off a fingernail. I hopped, said Ruby. The class giggled. Ruby's ears turned red. But I did. I hopped around the picnic table 10 times. Ruby looked around the room. Watch. Ruby sprang from her desk. She hopped forward. She hopped backward. She hopped sideways with both eyes shut. The class cheered and clapped their hands to the beat of Ruby's feet. Ruby was the best hopper they had ever seen. Miss Hart turned on the tape player and said, follow the leader, do the Ruby hop. So Ruby led the class around the room. Well, everyone copied her. At noon, Ruby and Angela hopped home for lunch. So let's pause and think about what Ruby is like at the end of the story. We know at the beginning of the story, she was copying everybody. She was copying her teacher. She was copying Angela. And at the end of the story, we realize that she's just being herself and people start to copy her. So at the end of the story, she's changing. She's not copying anyone anymore. The other kids in the classroom are copying her. But let's think again about the problem in the story. The problem was that Ruby kept copying other people and they didn't like it. She kept copying other people and they did not like it. And she thought maybe she needed to copy other people. But at the end of the story, we see that her solution was that she stopped copying people and she started to be herself. And it's so important to just be you. Don't be like anyone else, just be yourself. So again, at the beginning of the story, she was copying Angela and Miss Hart. And at the end of the story, she wasn't copying anyone. They were copying her. And her solution to her problem, because again, her problem was that she kept copying everybody and made them really upset. Her solution was to stop copying people and just be herself. And that is the best thing to do. So I hope that you enjoy the story of Ruby the Copycat, again, by Peggy Rathmann, who is not only the author, but also the illustrator. So remember to be thinking about character change, what a character is like at the beginning of the story and what they're like at the end. Well, enjoy the rest of your Thursday, continue to work hard, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.